Hi, I'm James McGrail, the newest member of the Applied Anthropology Network team. I'm going to be taking over editing, hosting, and publishing the podcast version of AAN events like this one. In this episode, you'll be hearing a presentation from Simon Roberts. Simon is the founder of Stripe Partners, an organisation which bridges the gap between business and what happens in the real world. Drawing on his years of ethnographic experience, Simon explains embodied knowledge, the information that is unconsciously picked up by our body for use in every area of our lives. He summarises some of the key ideas from his book, The Power of Not Thinking. Simon then challenges us to answer the question, how can you make research consultancy more embodied, and how do we implement these approaches in the post-lockdown world? Join us as we explore what we can achieve if we stop thinking and start trusting our bodies. If you've not attended an AAN event before, here's Markus Rolf-Müller to explain the idea further.
In each event, we provide you with an impulse of human-centeredness, presented by applied anthropologists to improve the world, impulse by impulse by impulse. Each session ends with a challenging or provocative question to spark discussion among the audience and the broadly growing community of applied anthropologists. The AAN impulses are provided by applied clubs, a space for sub-communities and more specific groups of applied anthropologists to meet, exchange knowledge, discuss needs and action items, and to find mentors, friends, and jobs that can support your career as an applied anthropologist on the long run. Make sure to give us a like, subscribe, and share this with your friends or network in case you liked what you are about to experience.
So if you'd like to join this exciting journey, definitely reach out to Marcus or Laura. At the AAN, there's always an opportunity to be engaged. And now, without further ado, here's Simon Roberts with his impulse titled Bring Back the Bodies, Reflections on Embodied Knowledge and Communication.
So people often ask what the inspiration for writing the book was, and the short answer is a camping trip that myself and some colleagues took a team from Duracell on back in 2014, which in many ways was the first kind of lived attempt, as it were, to take the idea of embodiment and to sort of make it tangible, make it real for a commercial client. And it was a really successful project, and I write a bit more about it in the book. And in many ways, then it's just sort of provided it's provided a sort of a foundation for a lot of thinking that not just me, but my colleagues at Stripe Partners have been doing around why the body matters in how we understand the world, how we understand culture, how we understand other people. So that's kind of where it all began. And I suppose I want to start with a sort of a simple observation, and I suspect that there's nobody on this call that cannot ride a bike. If you can't ride a bike, apologies, but I suspect that most of you can. But I also suspect that most of you have no idea how you do it. And you wouldn't be alone, because most of the world's kind of engineers who've been exploring this idea for well over 100 years, actually, almost since the birth of the first thing that looked like a bicycle, have taken nearly 100 years to figure out how it is that a bicycle balances, both when we're on it, but also when we're not on it. So in other words, there's kind of huge amounts of physics and mechanics involved in the riding of a bicycle. But the interesting thing is that none of that is actually important for anybody riding a bicycle to know. Right, so there's a form of knowledge about how to ride a bike, which operates almost completely independently of our practical ability to actually ride a bicycle. And it seems to me, or it's always seemed to me, that this is a really good way of encapsulating a difference between what one might call propositional knowledge about the world, knowledge that we can write down, that we can make explicit in some ways, whether through equations or words or other means, and a more embodied form of knowledge, a form of knowledge which is not reliant on either explicit understanding of what it is that we're doing and how we're doing it, and nor any kind of theoretical kind of elucidation of it. So embodied knowledge, as I kind of describe it in the book, is a form of knowledge which is which exists when we've acquired kind of practical understanding and ability, either through mere perception, or not mere perception, but perception, and also through experience. And it's a very interesting form of knowledge because it allows us to do things quite instinctively without thinking, hence the title of the book. And it's a form of knowledge that resides not in our brains, right, but in our bodies, and is therefore kind of almost beyond kind of rational or at least conscious control. So we can do a lot of things without thinking about what we're doing. And this is a very different way of thinking about knowledge, right, compared to, you know, large sways, not only of Western philosophical tradition, but other traditions too. And every story needs a sort of a fool guy, and Descartes is my fool guy. He's the baddie. And I think, you know, it's reasonable to assert that this distinction between mind and body emerges through the work of Descartes and has rippled on through the centuries. And it's a very pervasive way of thinking. It shows up in everyday ways of talking about what we know. You know, we talk about people being brainy, and it shows up in the education system, we know, which highly privileges intellectual, you know, cognitive endeavor and education, as opposed to more practical ways of engaging or learning about the world. So there's a snobbery, if you will, about the brain versus the body. But what's also the case is that in a range of disciplines, and I think this is the thing that really fascinated me when researching the book, is a range of disciplines are coming to a shared agreement, if you will, that the bodies are actually central to how we think, and that actually without bodies, we would be really very little. So if you imagine as a thought experiment, a kind of a brain in a vat, what would that brain be able to think about? How would it actually experience the world, let alone get around the world? But what would it actually be able to encounter of the world if it was just a brain in a vat? And of course, we're surrounded by brains in vats. They're called computers. And AIs, in a way, are kind of brains in vats, right? Because they don't actually have any material, as it were, engagement with the world themselves. So Henry Marsh is actually a neuroscientist, and he's written a lovely book called Do No Harm, which is about his adventures in neuroscience and neurosurgery, and a much better book than mine. So take a look at that. But anyway, he is just one of many, many people from a range of different disciplines, whether it's cognitive science or philosophy or anthropology, and indeed the field of AI, or at least progressive wings of the AI movement, who's coming to this kind of clear kind of conclusion that we need our bodies in order to think, that we can't really think without being embodied. So what I do in the book, and I am obviously going to race through this in a few slides and in a few minutes, but what I try and do in the book is set up the problem, as it were. So and then talk about not necessarily the solution, but at least break down into 5 components this idea of embodied knowledge. And in one of the first chapters, which is about observation, I talk really about how we understand the world, not merely through our eyes, actually. So, you know, the Western world is very brain centric, but it's also very ocular centric. But actually observation is about full-bodied immersion in the world. And I use the story of Thomas Thwaites, a British designer who wanted to understand what it was like to be a goat. And he decided if he was going to understand what it was like to see the world as a goat sees the world, then you've got to become a goat. So here he is on a Swiss mountainside. But the simple point here is that rather than try to understand the world, if you will, rationally, in a detached kind of cognitive way, our best understandings of the world come when we are immersed in it. And that's something for an anthropologist. It shouldn't be controversial, perhaps, but it's something that's very much washed out, if you will, of the ways in which we tend to think about how we understand the world. It's all about critical distance and detachment and rationality. And so this chapter is really an argument for saying, no, to understand the world, we've got to go in feet first, as Thomas Thwaites did. The second kind of feature or quality of embodied knowledge is that it is slowly acquired in many ways. We don't learn to ride a bicycle first time around, nor do we learn how to blow glass immediately. It's a form of knowledge which is acquired through practice, through repetition. And as we acquire a skill, our need, as it were, to depend on rational control of what we're doing tapers down. So when you sit in a car and you drive a car, or when you ride a bicycle, you're not thinking about what you do, but your body knows what to do. And so I talk in this sort of chapter about how we acquire skills and how we move through from being a kind of a novice to a master or an expert, and how, as we do that, what essentially happens is kind of linguistic knowledge. Think of the instructions for how to ride a bike, actually kind of get, if you will, deprioritized in the rankings, and actually our bodies can take over. Another feature of embodied knowledge is its immense ability to allow us to improvise, and a lot in this chapter I talk about kind of autonomous vehicles and the efforts underway to create level 5 autonomy. Level 5 autonomy essentially means a car that can drive any place, anywhere, any conditions. It's as all of the autonomous vehicle boosters would have had us believe. Elon Musk is about the only person that really thinks it's doable, and he does smoke dope. So, you know, one of the things that separates us from autonomous vehicles is our ability, if you will, to be able to operate in circumstances which are very uncertain, that unfold in different ways every time we do things. No piece of jazz is ever played the same way. No car ride is ever the same. Circumstances are always changing, but we know how to respond. So improvisation is really about the ways in which embodied knowledge allow us to deal with, you know, the manifold uncertainties and ambiguities of the world around us, and also represent as like a very good contrast to the ways in which we often think about how computers understand the world, right? And computers are often, if not always, programmed in quite rule-based ways, and the world isn't rule-based. Anthropologists are good at explaining the fact that people may describe the world in rule-based ways, but it tends not to be rule-based in the ways that people tend to describe it to us. I also talk about kind of empathy, which typically kind of emerges in the literature as a kind of psychological concept, if you will, right? It's something that we come to inhabit psychologically other people's worlds or situations. You know, we walk in their shoes, but the literature often talks about empathy as a kind of state of mind. And in this chapter, I talk a lot more about how the body is central to how we gain empathy. There are mechanisms in the brain called mirror neurons, which allow us to understand people's emotions, their feelings, their state of mind, if you will, purely by being in their presence. So there's a kind of physical substrate to kind of empathy, which has often been washed out of our accounts of it. This is actually a scene from a 24-hour simulation simulator that I went to in Hong Kong when I was researching the book, which is designed to enable kind of people from lots of different walks of life to experience the life of a refugee. And I think the thing that struck me in participating in this, that we often think about kind of teaching people things as sitting them down quietly, you know, privileging the mind. You know, I'm going to fill your mind with information about these other people's circumstances, and this does it sort of quite the opposite way around, if you will, which is it primes the body to receive more formal, propositional, explicit knowledge by putting the body under, a lot of strains, if you will. So everything that we went through in this simulator was essentially a kind of prelude to delivering more factual information. And it was incredibly effective as a result. And then the final kind of quality or characteristic of embodied knowledge that I talk about is retention. And once upon a time, I lived in India, and I used to go to this restaurant that served. Many years later, I went back to that restaurant, and I was immediately transported back to my time doing field work there. The taste of and the smell of the food was uncannily similar to how it had tasted and smelled 15 years earlier. And many of you will know the kind of famous reference from Proust's book about the Madeleine and how that transports him back, dipping that in his tea and eating it, transports him back to his childhood. So embodied knowledge is knowledge that is retained in ways that are not actually particularly well understood. It's sensory knowledge that stays with us. And it's also the sort of knowledge that is deeply cultural, right? So a lot of our bodily comportment and our identity is tied up in our bodies. So I talk in the book about how soldiers become soldiers through, bodily discipline, if you will, and their ways of walking and their ways of holding their bodies are as much a facet of being a soldier as knowing how to pull the trigger on a gun. So in this chapter, I explore these kind of elements of knowledge that stay sedimented or get sedimented in our bodies, if you will. So those are the kind of 5 principal kind of dimensions that I've chosen to kind of unpick embodied knowledge through the lens of, and then what I do in the final stage of the book is to say, well, embodied knowledge is all of those things, at all of the same time, as it were. So it's not kind of analytically I've distinguished elements of it, but actually it's an aggregate. And then I explore how embodied knowledge can be used or is being used in a range of different environments, in the world of business, in the world of politics and policy making, in the world of sort of design and creativity through activities like body storming, and then finally explore the relevance of the ideas of embodied knowledge or embodiment more generally to the development of AI and robotics, where it kind of turns out actually that most of the advances, the big advances in robotics and artificial intelligence have come from a view of the world that looks much more like the embodied view of the world than one might previously have expected. So that's the kind of the book in a nutshell. I've probably taken a few more minutes than Marcus wanted me to, but that was going to be it for that section. So I'm sort of open for questions, and then we can, if people don't have any, we can jump on to the next leg of the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Simon. Very, very interesting introduction to your book. Thanks so much. I suggest for questions, you just raise your hand like Laura did. Awesome. And I will let Laura start so that we have some time until the next person raised their hand or her hand.
I was actually clapping. It wasn't a raised hand, but I'm also happy to jump in with a question. Simon, thank you so much. Really fascinating and really exciting also that we have that example of bringing the body back into the inquiry into the world. On the last point that you made about your collaboration with robotics and AI, I was wondering how do you think the developments in virtual reality are going to change our experience of embodiment, or will they?
Yeah, I should probably move on to my next slide. We're actually doing a project on collaboration and in the context of work and VR at the moment, actually. So this is from my colleagues who have been dog feeding a VR app. I think it's a really good question. I think there is quite an interesting and significant body of work being done, which shows quite clearly that the experiences we have in virtual reality are quite visceral. They're quite embodied. In other words, you know, when you're wearing a mask, you can stand on top of a virtual skyscraper and look over the edge and actually feel an emotion, right? And feel an emotion that you probably wouldn't feel looking at a sort of two-dimensional video of the same scene. And there's been some interesting studies around, I know, a virtual tour of an American abattoir and what that led, well, how it led to people not eating meat, having been through the virtual abattoir. So I think, although I wouldn't necessarily cast myself as the biggest booster of VR, I'm not utterly convinced that it's going to be the sort of the next big thing. I do think it's very consistent. What people are finding about it is it's quite consistent with this notion of embodiment, that actually we can feel like we're part of things. We can do things in a mask, like, you know, whiteboarding or post-it noting, that feel much closer to what we're missing when we try to do them on a Miro board or a mural board, for example. So I think there's hope and promise, and I think it's a good demonstration of why we should take the idea of embodiment seriously.
Great, thank you. And I see that there's a number of people that are raising their hand.
Yeah, I think Martin was the first one. Yeah. So I'll give you the stage, Martin.
Yes, hey. Hi, Simon. Nice to see
Martin.
you. I love this. I've started to get into your book. Thanks very much. For one thing, which you mentioned sort of as you went through the main points, which was how we know some things by being in the same space. And of course, you know, we've been working from home with our colleagues across the world for a year now. Yeah. Many of us have. And of course, it's one of the big questions that that various of the global business are trying to solve: how can you work in the future together? And I remember when I first started working for a large corporation, I wondered, how can you do like global requirements gathering? How can you connect between those moments when you are not able to be together? And I'm curious of, what do you think we're losing? What is not replicable at all? What do we need to tell those guys who are trying to develop, not just the Elon Musks of the virtual experiences or the digital experiences of the things that we can't do ever? Not just get close to or kind of try to help because that's the situation, but what's the things we're just not going to be able to do?
You've set up the second half of the presentation. I'll pick on one thing that I think can't be done, and actually it's something I talk about in the book, which is, you know, I talk about minaret craftsmen in Yemen and the apprentices who learn how to do very ornate work on minarets purely by observation. Right? And Aristotle said that humans learn through mimesis. More than any other animal, humans learn through mimesis, through copying. And so actually, I think one of the big challenges for, certainly for a remote world, but increasingly, I think for a hybrid world, the hybrid world that, you know, certainly my business is planning to be operating in, is how do younger people acquire the sorts of skills that many of us might use every day, right? And many of these things are not easily explicable, right? You know, how do we learn how to ride a bike? You know, our dad pushes us on one and says, pedal, and we do, right? And we learn through that way. So we learn through doing, but we also learn through mimesis. And I think that's going to be a real challenge. I think how skill gets acquired in a remote world, particularly in an industry and I'm making a generalization or at least an assumption here, but you know, we work in an industry, or I feel like I work in an industry where a lot of how we do what we do is not documented, right? It's, you know, we're not accountants. We don't do exams for 3 years and then say, right, I'm trained to do an audit of a company. You know, I don't mind saying that a lot of what we do is completely made up, right? And we make it up sometimes every time we do it because we learn how to do it better. So how you learn a skill in that world, I don't know. So I think that's a big challenge and why we need to kind of get back to the office, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Great. Next one would have been Gregor.
Yeah, hello. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, everyone. I've read your book. Here it is. It's lovely. Yeah, it's a lovely book. Thank you. My question is very simple. The book was written before the current crisis. So if you wrote it today, after the crisis, would it be different? Would you change something, or would you even emphasize something more?
Yeah, if I'd written it before the crisis, I could have gone into the bloody bookshops. It would have been so much better. And I could have had a proper launch party. It's a really good question. How would it have been different? I think almost I would have made the argument even stronger. I mean, I think in a way, right, you know, the principal story for me of COVID is it's shone a bright light on lots of things. Indeed, lots of things that, you know, we need to have a light shone on, like inequality or, you know, which workers actually matter and which workers really don't add much value to our lives, but get paid huge amounts of money. So I think the thing that it has it has shone a light on for me is there are, as I would put it, many virtues of a virtual life. You know, all of this stuff is wonderful. I'm going to talk about that in a sec, but I think what it has reminded us is that physical connection, you know, a hug or, you know, a cup of tea together, whatever it is, there is something irredeemably important and human about that. And no amount of great technology and virtual reality masks will ever, and I can say that with such confidence and conviction, will ever replace what we get when we're together. So I think in a way, I'd have just turned the dial up to 11 on the argument, if that makes sense. And I'd have probably written a chapter about work and offices.
Very good, Simon. I mean, Simon Roberts now, I would have a follow-up question, but I might keep it because I think you might talk about it. Simon Provost, you would be next.
Hello, Simon. Many thanks for the talk. I also have the book lying next to me. It's I'm about 2/3 through it. I have a very maybe a bit more complicated question that, you know, reflects a little bit on the themes being exposed here, and I kind of think about the ramifications of consciousness. And sometimes I think that, you know, in order for us to do something conscious, it seems that we will be able to reflect on something like you said, it's a form of declarative memory. And then I wonder, in that sense, I don't know if you've ever given any thought on it, but it might seem as if consciousness is something collective, always. I don't know if you share that thought, or are we just using the word consciousness in more of a manner of speaking and maybe not in the very substantial way that is consciousness?
Yeah. Oh God, I think that's a good, very hard question. Yeah, I mean, I think it links back. I'm slightly going to dodge the question, but I think it links back to the previous point, actually, which is that, you know, I do think the nature of reality is often that it's a shared reality, right? And I think some of the things that I explore in the book, like the idea of mirror neurons, which, although, you know, obviously in the neurons in the brain, but they allow us to understand other people that we're in, you know, in proximity to. And in that sense, I think, you know, it's not so difficult to argue that consciousness in that way is kind of collective. You know, and I'll talk about mood. I think mood is something that's very physical. You know, we create and communicate mood through our bodies. And so I don't know whether that is evading your question, but I think, you know, there is a very collective nature to our experience. And I think, again, what COVID has shown us is that sort of self-isolating at home individually and just using Zoom is not quite the same thing. You know, just sitting opposite somebody and drinking a cup of coffee with them does something that a coffee over Zoom will never do.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. I would have a follow-up question. Sorry, Simon, go for it.
I just want to say thanks for the answer.
No,
it's indeed very helpful.
Good one.
Yeah.
Cool. So Simon, Roberts, I wanted to ask, so I read your little post on co-living spaces being a liminal space, right, for transformation, for example, running through a journey, or it's kind of part of your journey in life. And I wonder, how is being in the same room with your whole innovation team or whole colleagues also some sort of ritual or liminal space in your perspective?
Can we talk about that when I go through the next bit? Can I go through the next bit? Because so many of the questions seem to be sort of hovering on this question. Would that be all right?
Yeah, then go for it, Simon.
Shall I just crack on?
Yeah.
So like I said, I mean, this is a bit of a thought experiment. So it's not fully formed, but yeah, I think it's kind of an obvious thing to say, but it's worth, you know, and we're doing it right now, right? Our present life is kind of, and that's wonderful, isn't it? And we can all be here across the globe together. And this guy, who's a academic at INSEAD in Paris, I think he had a beautiful way of putting it, right? Which is, you know, what we're suffering from is the kind of the absence of presence and the presence of absence. Yeah, he really kind of gets at the heart of like what we're all feeling, right? In or have been feeling over the last year, yeah, living life in rectangles. And the bit that's really obvious for me that's missing in all of this is the body. And you know, there are four things that kind of keep coming up with to me. I mean, whatever you think of Boris Johnson, you know, he's not very good when he hasn't got a lot of his own MPs behind him, you know, cheering him on, right? So there's something about the mood that he needs in order to be the sort of buffoon that he is. You know, classical music concerts or any concerts, frankly, you know, are, you know, a fraction of what they were really about without resonating bodies within a concert hall. You know, a football stadium, you know, what do the sports broadcasters do at the moment? They're piping crowd music in, right? Because otherwise, what do you feel? You feel nothing. Even, you know, as a spectator sitting on your sofa watching a game of football without some sense of bodies there, there's nothing. And then this quiz show, comedy show in the UK, which again is just like nothing without having kind of four very funny people bantering with each other and being and building off each other's jokes. So four very obvious for me domains where as soon as you take the body out of the picture, something is just sadly and obviously missing. So this made me, and this is a bit of a detour, so kind of bear with me, but I don't know whether any of you are familiar with a guy called Claude Shannon. He's a genius. He worked at Bell Labs in the sort of 50s and 60s. And if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't be here in our rectangles, because what he did was essentially create a universal model of communication, which nobody has bettered. It's kind of basically, this is it. This is a model of communication. You do not need another one. this is it, which sounds like a grand claim to make, but it's a claim that is very easy to make. And this is from his master's thesis, and it's probably one of the most significant scientific publications of the 20th century. And without it, none of the digital world as we know it would exist, right? And one of the things he was really interested in trying to do with that, with his theory of communication, was understand information better, right? And he made he did this really clever thing where he sort of jammed kind of Bayesian logic and Boolean logic into a view of communication and information theory. And really what he was talking about was the fact that information is about reducing uncertainty, right? So, where we kind of, the richest, as it were, informationally, the richest messages are the ones that reduce uncertainty the greatest amount. Okay, so really quite kind of very complex ideas in many ways. But what he was able to do with that was to say, actually, if that's the case, let's look at language. And when we look at language, what we discover is that language isn't actually random. Sorry, I'm having slight trouble with my mouse. There we go. So language, actually, there's a lot of probability in language. In other words, the occurrence of words, of letters next to each other is not random at all. In languages, you can probabilistically determine, as it were, what is likely to come after a T. Code breaking is all about trying to find these relationships between letters. So as I demonstrate, hopefully with this, you know exactly what's being said here, right? Even though I've missed a lot of it out. Now you're probably saying, well, what on earth is Simon talking about, and what relationship has this got to anything? Well, the point is that once he discovered or proved this, right, he was able to say, well, now we can do digital communication, right? Because I don't need to send everything down a wire. I can compress things. So the whole way that we communicate these days is essentially by stripping stuff out in order to send it down a pipe, right? Which makes the world that we live in possible. So without his kind of theory, we'd still be using, sort of tin can with a piece of string, pretty much. We wouldn't, but anyway. So what strikes me as interesting about that is that, as ever, we make our tools as humans, right? But they in turn, of course, they make us, they shape us. So what we've kind of done is we've taken Claude Shannon's kind of masterpiece of thinking and all of the implications which mean the digital world and the digital communication that we all enjoy is possible. But what it's done is essentially kind of transform the very way that as humans we communicate with each other. So we don't pass zeros. Well, we do pass zeros and ones between each other, and we're doing so now. And we can communicate in very nuanced ways by passing zeros and ones between each other. But what it does do, of course, is by enabling this form of communication, it has shaped the world that we live in. It's shaped our lives. It's shaped how we communicate in quite important ways. So if you go back to his kind of claim that messages that resolve the greatest amount of uncertainty are the richest in information, you have to say, when you're in an environment like this, yes, we're exchanging zeros and ones, but we're also trying to exchange other things, right? Because I'm trying to think, well, what are these people that are looking at me actually thinking? Do they think I'm mad? Are they waiting for me to get to the end? Do they want a cup of tea? Are they bored? I don't know any of these things. I know a lot about what you look like from the screens that I see in front of me, but I don't know much else. So in other words, much of the communication tools that we have are basically leaving lots on the table. And of course, what they're leaving on the table is what our bodies are really good at picking up for us, right? Often without thinking. So I think there are kind of at least four, and there are probably other ways. So this is a kind of, and if I'd written the book again, maybe I'd have talked a bit more about some of this. But I think I think our bodies are really crucial to how we generate meaning and understanding, share meaning and understanding, communicate at the end of the day. And so, you know, one of those ways is that our bodies obviously do huge amounts of talking for us, right? You know, the sort of simple level, what we wear and our adornments, you know, the jewelry that we wear or whatever it is, they signal huge amounts of things about us. But it's also the case that, you know, the mere act of using our hands to communicate, arguably, you know, according to some psychologists, is absolutely critical for how we even articulate. So if we weren't able to use our hands, we would find it very difficult to communicate. So actually there are people who are deaf and they use their hands, right? So people who are blind, they use their hands. So they're not actually meaningfully, they're not doing anything with them, but they need to do, well, rather they are doing something with them. They couldn't communicate without using their hands. So our bodies do talk in very kind of obvious and important ways that are absolutely crucial to how we articulate ideas. The other bit, I suppose, that bodies do is they quite obviously signal for us. So they represent kind of real estate, if you will, that locate us socially, culturally, and in other ways. And they signal attention and how available we are, and whether we're engaged, whether we're bored. The other thing, as I've touched on, is that bodies allow us to create and understand other people's moods. So what is becoming kind of very clear in the field of kind of embodied cognition and also the growing field of embodied communication is that mood is not just a psychological state, it's a bodily state, and it transfers from people to people through the body. And that collectively, as we start to share each other's moods, you know, we kind of almost reside in them. We resonate. Other people's moods resonate within us. So, you know, resonation or resonate. Lots of things in nature resonate. You know, fireflies resonate with each other. They entrain. Organ pipes entrain with each other. Bodies kind of entrain with each other. You know, and a good example of that is yawning. You know, it makes us feel tired, and we often do it ourselves, right? And then we, you know, we feel tired because we yawn. We don't often yawn because we're tired. So, so anyway, body's central to that kind of notion of or element of communication. And finally, our bodies place us. So, how we locate ourselves in a room. Imagine a drinks party or something going on in the office. Actually being able to move our bodies through physical space allows us to participate or disengage from conversation. It allows us to grab people for a quick chat. It allows us to move into a conversation that interests us or move away from one that's boring us, right? And it allows us to pick up things that are not necessarily in our central field of view or field of hearing. And pick up. So, so for me, I think there's at least 4 ways and probably more, and there's probably a better way of categorizing them than the way I've done at the moment. But I think that spatial kind of dimension of what bodies, of the role that bodies play in communication is not necessarily appreciated enough. But what has struck me as interesting is how many services like the online.town have come along, right, which allows you to move your avatar through a virtual office and kind of move it to the kitchen and start talking to people there. A very poor simulacrum of what it's really like to be in an office, but a way that I think a tool or a software platform that demonstrates some of what the kind of the placing of bodies is actually all about, right? And in terms of our ability to engage or disengage from communication. So that's, as I said, a slightly kind of mad kind of trip through, you know, Claude Shannon theory of communication and the body. I don't know whether any of it actually makes sense, but it just struck me as kind of an interesting way of trying to frame, the current moment and, our obvious reliance on tools and what we all, I think, recognize is missing somewhere in these tools, wonderful though they are in their own ways.
Great. Was that the end, Simon?
Yeah, that's the end. Sorry, I would have had a slide that said the end.
Okay. Yeah, very nice. Big applause for that second part of your impulse. Very, very interesting. I think we will open up for a few follow-up questions, but then we also want Simon still to kind of ask his challenging question. But maybe let's open up if there's any question about this part of the talk. So again, raise your hand or just shut out. Doesn't seem like it yet.
Is anyone familiar with Claude Shannon?
Some
really worth it.
Yeah, go for it.
No, I mean, it's just, he's a fascinating kind of thinker, scientist, just sort of, I think it's just amazing that you can have these individuals that are not really particularly well known, without whom the world as we know it just wouldn't exist. So I really strongly recommend there's the biography of him that I've referenced.
If there are no follow-up questions to this talk, I suggest, Simon, maybe you can quickly introduce your challenging question.
Yeah.
And then I suggest we maybe break out into a few groups still for 5 minutes, just so people can have a more interactive chat, and then we come back and discuss for another few minutes.
Does that question make sense to people? Any questions about the question?
So the question is, how can you make your research consultancy work more embodied, and how might you do that in the post-lockdown world? I will create 4 breakout rooms now automatically, and then I suggest that you just keep it flowing and discuss this question. I will also post it in the chat again, and I think we should just do that very quickly, 5 minutes, also giving Simon a break to brief, and then we come back and do a bit more discussion. Okay, everyone is back. I think we had some lovely discussions and very interesting. I know that for a fact that Inga was just cut short. I hope everyone has one person that can quickly summarize the discussion, and then I think we will have to also finalize today's session and end the whole thing. Okay, so who wants to summarize? Who's the summarizer of the group with Laura, Martin, and Simon, and so on?
And I was unanimously chosen by all others to do this, so I can do that. So we discussed a lot around the fact of what makes things more embodied, and we felt the experiences we had when we took clients or colleagues into the field was always something which was very strong and very lasting, in the way how Simon had mentioned as well. So one of the things we try to think of what we can do once we can go back to the office or meeting our clients and colleagues is to really think of where these moments are where we can make that easy for people to experience that. We've all experienced that once we took a colleague along to the field or to a research session, it was a whole lot easier to do so again. So is there ways of how we could represent that in a form so that it's easy for them to step out of that, just send me the TLDR, and really to kind of make us aware and find ways where we can bring that rich context that you get from your body senses in a different form into the work that we do. We had lots of examples, but I'll stop here so someone else can talk as well.
Very interesting, Martin. Thanks so much. As a matter of fact, we also just talked about bringing clients into the field and also feeling the whole atmosphere and the whole environment. So I'm just gonna hand over to one of the people in my group. I don't know, Naomi, do you wanna summarize, or who wants to summarize?
I did hear all the answers of my group. I don't know if I'm able to summarize because a lot of things were said that were new to me. However, the thing that stood out to me was maybe that you should really include, of course, the rich context of the participant. And by doing this, well, we have to do a lot of online interviews, and I try to do like do online research using like data and other forms of information about the context of the participant. And I'm sure the other group members can add a lot of things to this, so maybe invite them.
Yeah, sure. I mean, go for it.
Oh, I think we're just talking about making embodied knowledge explicit in the language we use, both in the scoping process and in the research that we're doing. So you want to make sure that those inputs are things that are made explicit, and you reference the data that sort of comes in a way that isn't purely reflective and cerebral. And then Inga, I'll pass to her. She was talking about sort of eliciting embodied knowledge from clients in the beginning of the process.
Inga, do you want to add to that?
Here I am. Yes, I found my unmute button. The embodied, the process that I think of as really critical is the framing of the client question. And once that's, as we start out assuming that we share the same framing of a question, if we step back and use the embodied approach to decipher and deconstruct what the assumptions are, I think that's a very strong idea that I hadn't considered before. But clearly the assumptions are built on those non-conscious, non-aware, non-programmed kinds of movements and learning procedures and so on. So to find out, how did you know that? To find out what is that material like? To find out what did you expect, but to do it in a much more embodied fashion. And I wonder about role playing in that situation too. That's about where I was thinking. This is a new way of understanding for me, so it's maybe not that clearly stated.
Yeah, I think one of the really, kind of goes without saying, but a difficult thing about writing a book about knowledge that doesn't really have, is not associated with words. And I think a lot of this is, this point about what do clients know, or how do we frame, what we think they know. In one of the bits of the book I talk about this exercise, or activity called body storming, which is definitely worth kind of thinking about. And it's both good for kind of acting out ideas or acting out prototypes, product services kind of prototypes. Actually, what's really fascinating about it is what it reveals about what we think about things. And I think it's really useful in a client context to kind of have people kind of act out scenarios of how a thing that they've come up with may or may not work. Because what it reveals to them quite quickly is kind of like how jagged an experience that might be for one of their users, or like how silly the idea is, or actually how natural it feels. So there's something here about just trying to get at, at an embodied knowledge, which by definition, does not announce itself, right? It doesn't articulate itself. It doesn't come neatly. It doesn't lend itself to being articulated. I think Bourdieu's kind of like says a lot about this, right? Which is a lot of this stuff just doesn't have to announce. It doesn't have to say. It doesn't have to announce itself. It doesn't have to because it's taken for granted. And this is the fundamental, I think, with fundamental aspect of embodied knowledge, that it is utterly taken for granted. So finding ways of prizing it out of people beyond just interviewing people. Because as Polanyi says, we know much more than we can tell. And that's the fundamental challenge we all face as researchers.
Cool. Anyone wants to follow up on that?
Yeah, so in our group, we basically talks about how when one is working in a tech company, it's really hard to explain the thought of embodied research and thinking to engineers who doesn't have this similar thoughts and process of thinking. So one question we have is how to define a rational or rationalization, or how to actually define that to the engineers when you are working with them, especially in large corporations and such. And then another conclusion we come up with is that education is very important when it comes to narrowing the gap between engineers and people who are doing non-tech. Yeah, so that's what we come up with.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy to kind of characterize kind of tech people and non-tech people, isn't it? And there's a certain sense in it, because I think, I think we do all understand that, I think it makes sense at some level to say that, people that build software, are having to kind of operate with a view of the world, or at least are trying to take a vision of the world and reduce it to lines of code. I think, over my career, the most powerful way of getting people to see what the world looks like is not done through kind of communicating at them. It's having them experience it. And I think, something that Martin and Laura and I'm sorry, I can't see the other name, talked about was, perhaps something I didn't really articulate very well about the Shannon, sort of Claude Shannon's point, which is that, his point is about efficiency of communication, right? So, if you work at Facebook, everything's about the too long didn't read, the TLDR, and that's all about efficiency of communication. And it's very hard to make the case for inefficient communication, right? Which is often the case that I'm trying to make to people, which is, I need your team to come with me to somewhere in America for a week, right? And that's going to be worthwhile. Oh, no, why didn't you just send me the TLDR? Well, no, that's not really the point. So, the argument that we've been trying to make at Stripe Partners for the last 7 years is basically, give us your team, let us take them into the world. Yes, in some ways it is extravagant, and certainly post-COVID, and, our carbon footprint is not particularly great, but there is something wonderful about the inefficiency of it, right? And not only because you can experience it for yourself, but there are a whole load of second order benefits of that way of working, because actually it means a team is out of the office together, a team is together, they're co-located together, they're talking and focusing and thinking about something together in a concentrated way. So, we built our business, our practice around this idea that, in a sense, there is a virtue in this somewhat extravagant way of learning about the world. And to the point about retention, and I think, Martin, you spoke to this, is people remember it. Engineers, product managers, they will remember an instance, a thing, an experience they had, and they will never forget it, right? And that's what's really important, I think, is it's very easy to forget, like, what are the 10 longest rivers in the world? I haven't got a clue. I was probably told once. I probably had to learn it, but I've forgotten. I'll never forget how to ride a bike or change a light bulb or scramble an egg, right? And I think an engineer who has that experience and won't forget it, that will live on for a long, long time and will shape the way that they think about the code that they write, the products they design. So it's hard to make this argument in uber rational organizations, particularly ones that are trying to save money. But I think there is a case to be made. It's a long-term case. It's a cultural case. It's about cultural change as much as anything. But it needs good economic tailwinds rather than economic headwinds to make that case, in my experience.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Is there any group left to summarize the discussion? Yeah, Simon, go for it. Thanks. Simon Provost.
Yeah, so there's like a host of different ideas being passed and being deliberated in our in our 10 minutes. But one of the things that have been pitched that, you know, were highlighted is that participant observation really drastically needs reinvention. We need new ways to communicate embodiment, and thus we need new methods to make it more concrete. And I think bodily concreteness is perhaps the baseline of this entire presentation, both on behalf of Simon Roberts and what everyone has been using on. So let me deviate from that baseline and say that the reason why, for instance, the bodily concreteness is, for instance, not really achieved is, for instance, because the body has become more privatized. We just have like this half profile, so to speak. It's straightforward, and it mediates communication in an unforeseen way. I mean, there is, of course, ways to get to this point of vicarious existence, but it is definitely much more of a challenge. And we have been using on methods in team and in team connection and in team. I say that in the context of teams and stuff like that. And also, for instance, how in the company itself, this embodiment is more a ritual instead of an institutionalized methodological approach. Because, you know, we have mindfulness, for instance, in companies, and they say, okay, go to this room and do this exercise, and they have the power of suggestion through medicalized language. Good. But what about institutionalizing it and using as an actual modus operandi, for instance? I mean, it's actually what we have to do to make it more embodied in a way is just being ethnographers, because that is what we do at heart. It's using our body as a tool. It's, you know, our primal mover, so to speak, the way that we resonate with most, the way that we recollect knowledge. I don't know if anyone of my team wants to step in. I think I left some things behind here.
I mean, if I can, I jump in and say, I think, you know, the thing that at Strike Partners we've been trying to do for a long time is to say, and not always succeeding, by the way, but I think participant observation in the context of commercial kind of anthropology, business ethnography, whatever you want to call it, you know, got watered down somewhat into being 2 or 3 hour interviews, but they just happen to be in somebody else's house, right? Rather than in an office or a focus group facility. And so the thing that we've always tried to do is say, no, you know, like, how do we continue to push against that kind of, you know, trend of kind of making, you know, business anthropology about kind of 2 or 3 hour interviews and not much else. You know, no, we need to try and push harder and harder to always make things as embodied as possible, not just for the researcher and the research participant, but also for those that attend as well. I think the real challenge in the world of kind of COVID was, you know, there were plenty of advantages of being able to do, you know, Zoom interviews and stuff, but what it's done is further kind of give weight to this idea that kind of ethnography can just be an interview, right? Or at best an interview with a few exercises on a mural board or something like that. So I think personally, I think, you know, as a business, we're really looking forward to like redoubling our efforts and saying, like, you know, we were saying like it needs to be embodied, we really mean it. And now, you know, we really need to get back to that. You know, so I think it's given unfortunate weight to a trend that was already there, which is reducing ethnography in this kind of commercial space to interviews. And we need to take up the fight again with my book in hand this time.
Can I add something to this? Yeah, but if we are doing our research among, for example, professionals, as I do, virtual is their everyday reality. So if they have their meetings like daily stand-up online, so I believe that we can observe it and conduct participant observation.
even though it was their reality before COVID. So I believe that if we have this reflection, what we're doing, and we know that it's not just, you know, that I'm at someone's home or office, it's possible somehow, you know, it's better to do it like this now than nothing.
Well, it's certainly better than nothing. And I think if I took your point correctly, which is if people's working reality is Zoom stand-ups and neural workshops, then absolutely, you know, if you want to understand how the tiger hunts, go to the jungle, not the zoo. So I think that's absolutely right. You know, go where people are, and if that is their reality, then that's what you should do. But I think if your research, you know, is about a different kind of more embodied reality, you know, you want to understand, I don't know, the world of secondhand car buying or something in, you know, in physical spaces. I suspect that you probably want to do that in physical spaces. So I think it's certainly the case that if you're trying to understand how organizations collaborate, create, communicate, and digital tools are central to that, then meet people where they're at. But I think there are pretty significant chunks of life that are still not virtual, thankfully. So we need to go there.
Very interesting. I know for a fact that we have some leaders of the Applied Club for Digital Methods and Remote Research here. So I think there is an interesting or challenging thought that we have to take with us here, and also think about how does this embodiment get reflected on in this kind of special Applied Club on digital methods. And the other point is, I guess, how, I mean, obviously being in the same room, but also being in the same virtual space. Is there some sort of virtual embodiment there that we can research with a digital methods approach then?
I'll let somebody else answer that. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you have any follow-up thoughts on this, just be our guest. Otherwise, any other thoughts that you want to throw into the round? Otherwise, I think we are slowly or soon finishing off the session.
It sort of depends, I think, on the faculties of its expression. It can be that, you know, emanate from the body, and that we can make articulate. And actually, there are some ways to render, you know, embodiments intelligible through symbols, like Labanic script or Labanic. I don't know how do you put the stress, but there is one anthropologist that uses it. Her name is Brenda Furnell, and she has been working on dynamically embodied discursive practices. Basically, how, for instance, we create meaning through movement, and if we are, for instance, able to transcribe that, our movements can have a linear shape, and maybe we can try to make that understandable. But on the other hand, of course, it's missing a lot of those faculties of actually being able to render things intelligible, the way that, you know, Simon has described it in his book, and the way that, you know, we are used to as people in the field. So I think it's a question of trying to vivify whatever we see, or whatever we make people do, either through collaborative exercises, like, for instance, there is a lot of empathy in drawing together. You can use a mirror board, and the fact that there's shared laughter because we simply fail at drawing with our mouse pads, that can elicit some reactions that are maybe viscerally and vicariously felt. But that's just an idle thought, I think.
Great. Thanks, Simon Provost, in this case. Thanks so much, Simon Roberts, also for being here with us tonight and staying so long. We have already, again, reached 1.5 hours. We are always actually getting there. Then I want to give Simon Roberts the very final words for today's session, and I'm already thanking everyone for joining. Thanks so much.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me, and thanks for engaging with the ideas and the, you know, in the book. And yeah, many of you have been very good and already bought it. I'm very grateful for that. And then, yeah, some of you may be the lucky recipients of another copy. Well, not another copy. I think if you've already got one, maybe one's enough. Anyway, but thank you, and lovely to meet you all. And hopefully we can do it in an embodied way soon, somewhere. I certainly hope so.
Great. This was Simon Roberts with his Impulse, Bring Back the Bodies, Reflections on Embodied Knowledge,